Let's look at the railroads of Frankfort, Indiana. So we can see this map is so old I had to add the Indianapolis to Frankfort, Pennsylvania line right here. And right over here we have the Pennsylvania line that went from South Bend through Logansport down through Frankfort and made its way all the way to Terre Haute. This orange line, this was the nickel plate that got a lot of train traffic, and it made its way from Ohio down through Kokomo, down through Frankfort, and all the way to St. Louis. This made its way through Petersburg, Indiana. And then the green line, we run through Tipton, through Frankfort, and all the way to Peoria, Illinois. So Frankfort actually became an important location or hub for the nickel plate. And then this orange line, we have the Monon that went from Indianapolis through Frankfort and then all the way up through Monticello and then connected onto Monon onto the main line, the Chicago and Louisville, the Monon main line. So if you look at an aerial map of Frankfort, you can see how massive the old nickel plate train yard really was. This is the entire town, the size of Frankfort, and you can literally see how big this train yard was, or well, still is. But under the nickel plate, this was a very important location because many trains were formed here and sent to Peoria and sent to St. Louis. So if you look south of town on a map, you can easily see the tree line that surrounds the old roadbed of the Monon Railroad. And we can see the tree line makes its way right on up, curves all the way to 5th Street in Frankfort, and then it pretty much disappears. This line was removed in 1987 by CSX. And as you know, CSX had alternative routes into Indianapolis, like the B&O, and it did not need this line any longer. In fact, the online knowledge says CSX abandoned the Monon south of Delphi to Indianapolis around 1987. And there are areas in Indianapolis right now called the Monon Trail. It's like a walk trail. And it's become quite popular in Indianapolis. And if you were around the Frankfort area in the 1950s and early 60s, this is what you would have seen. They had passenger trains taking people from Indianapolis through Frankfort up to Monon and then to Chicago. Now this is an interesting picture from John Fuller, and this is 1971, and this is a picture inside of Frankfort, the Monon, 1971, and you can see that the Monon was doing pretty well. It was a successful railroad. It was making money. It was moving freight. It's almost a tragedy that CSX ever got its hands on the Monon, or it merged with the L&N, because this would be a money-making railroad today, right through Frankfort, making its way on up to Monon. Alright, so if you look at a map south of town, we see this is a line that goes down through Lebanon and into Indianapolis, this old Conrail line, or old Pennsylvania. That's now CSX, and right over here we can see the tree line surrounding the old roadbed of this old Pennsylvania line that used to go through Crawfordsville and then Terre Haute. And this line was definitely abandoned in 1974. Now my theory is that, the Penn Central merged in 1968, so for all we know, from 1970 all the way till 1974, they didn't even run major freight trains down this line because they knew that it was going to be removed in the near future. The last major freight train to ever come down this line could have been 1969, could have been 1970. But you can see they had superior routes that they could have easily went around this line from Terre Haute to Frankfort. The only thing keeping this railroad even alive in the 1960s was money being made in Crawfordsville. So after the Penn Central formation, this line had no chances of survival. Alright, so if you come off of the Interstate 65, and get off on State Road 28, and you're making your way into Frankfort, what you'll notice north is a obvious tree line. And this was the old nickel plate St. Louis main line. Back in the 50s and 60s, this was an important railroad. It got lots of train traffic. Now, what's so interesting about this railroad, this is the Clover Leaf Railroad. Before these four railroads all merged together to create the nickel plate, this was a struggling, ran down railroad. And then they all merged together, and then all of a sudden, this is now a very important railroad. They invested a lot of money upgrading this line, adding sidings all the way to St. Louis. And back in the 50s and early 60s, this line or track got at least 7 to 10 freight trains a day. And one of its central hub locations was Frankfort. Now there's a gentleman named Jerry A., last name A., in Malott, Indiana. This is from 2011. And he says Norfolk Southern was still running trains through Malott in the mid-80s. I believe Norfolk Southern got permission to abandon the line around 82 or 83. They were still running short freight trains down this St. Louis line, he believes, all the way up until 1986. Now, I myself remember in Covington, Indiana in 1985, 1986, and I believe I heard maybe one or two train horns over in Petersburg in 1987, and then I never heard a train ever again. But I remember 1985 and 86, maybe a couple times a week I would hear these blaring horns, train horns, over in Petersburg. And what I was actually listening to was Norfolk Southern maybe delivering freight to Charleston, Illinois, maybe some large grain elevator in between Charleston and Frankfort. And then one day you just never heard train horns ever again. So this guy Jerry, he actually has video of trains passing through Malott, and he also recorded them removing the track, which that would have been a sad day. That would have been very upsetting to actually watch them tear up this old nickel plate main line. Now here's a guy named Aaron from Crawfordsville, Indiana, and he lived around the New Richmond area. And he remembers back in 85 and 86 watching some of the last trains go down this old main line. And he says he remembers, or he recalls, when the line was torn out by NS, and a sad day for many it was. Right, so this is a picture in Frankfort of the old nickel plate, and you can see there was a massive production going on here. Alright, let's check out some of the profit that's being made in this township. So this is Norfolk Southern. This line goes to Lafayette, and then this was the old St. Louis line that's now cut off, and this is the large train yard. So you can see Frito-Lay, they make a decent amount of profit a year, but this ADM soy division right here, this is where millions of dollars gets made per year. In fact, NS, from my understanding, has put down welded rail from Lafayette all the way into Frankfort and maybe towards Tipton. These are the businesses that CSX also makes millions of dollars a year. Every other day, CSX will run 30 freight cars right on up from Indianapolis through Lebanon into Frankfort and make money off of these businesses. Now, right below this ADM, you can see right here is where the junction, or the main artery for the nickel plate, took place. This right here, this went to Peoria, and this went to St. Louis. Now there's another business that is east of town that they make a couple $1 million a year in profit. Now I don't know if this is like potash or what this is. I don't believe it's grain. I think it's something else. But you can see there's a lot of train cars and a lot of money being made. And this location, this would be Circleville. Like this is Frankfort, and about 8 miles east would be Circleville. And this looks like some kind of fertilizer or potash business. Now, something else that's kind of upsetting, if you were making your way through Frankfort down Washington Avenue, and then you turn south on O'Neill Street, you would actually pass over the old nickel plate line that went to Kokomo and up towards Buffalo. And under the nickel plate, this would have got a lot of train traffic. Now, as of today, it doesn't even get used. This rail from Frankfort all the way to Michigan town, it's still intact, but there are areas where the track doesn't even exist. And I'm going to say this could be a strategic move to prevent any kind of short line from wanting access into Frankfort and taking money from NS and CSX. Now, something else that's really interesting, and I don't understand this. Okay, CSX could easily abandon its line from Lebanon all the way up to Frankfort, which would be like 16 miles of track that they would not ever have to invest a dollar into. Because the only small business between Lebanon and Frankfort is this tiny little nothing. See this? It looks like it's been exempt for the last 10 years. Some company called Co-Alliance. I assume it's some kind of gas company. But what's so interesting, CSX could easily work out, negotiate some deal with Norfolk Southern, use its welded rail line from Lafayette right on into Frankfort, continue its business and its profit, and then it could allow 16 miles from Lebanon to Frankfort to just lie dormant. You know, let the weeds grow over the tracks. We'll just leave it alone. Maybe 20 years down the road, some big business will spur up. But they don't do that. They still run their freight trains right down this line from Frankfort through Lebanon to Indianapolis. All right, so if you look north of town in Frankfort, what you'll notice, this is where Conrail cut off the tracks of the old Pennsylvania line. See this north of town, this would be the old Monon headed up towards Monticello. You can see the tree line. And right over here is where Conrail removed the tracks. I believe it might be 10, 15 miles. And it was a strategic move to prevent a short line railroad. I think it was a Cincinnati short line. This short line railroad was very close to having access from Peoria to Logansport and all the way down to Indianapolis. And Conrail must have worked with Norfolk Southern or CSX. These major railroads are like, we're not going to allow this to happen. So they removed about 15 miles of track. And if you look on a map, this is Frankfort right over here. And Conrail removed north of town all the way up to this tiny little place called Bringhurst. And believe it or not, there was actually miles of welded rail. Because many years ago, Conrail was making money up in Kokomo and Logansport. But something happened in the early 90s. Some big business in Kokomo had closed down and the train traffic was literally cut in half. I remember seeing trains, Conrail trains, running through Lebanon in the 1980s, and they were large-size freight trains. And by the mid-90s, it was just Conrail delivering up to Frankfort. So something must have happened. All right, let's take a look at where the old nickel plate to Peoria got cut off. So you can see this is Kokomo. Right down here would be Frankfort. This is Lafayette. And the old nickel plate main line in 1987, Norfolk Southern cut off this line right outside of Hoopeston all the way to Gibson City. This is like 40 miles that they removed. And my theory is it was absolutely to prevent any short line in the future from having access to, let's say, Peoria, to Lafayette, or to Kokomo, or Indianapolis. So this is Hoopeston, Illinois, right outside of town. It's where the rails got cut off, or they tore it up all the way to Gibson City. And then they allowed a short line to be formed, the Kankakee and Beaverville, which is doing quite well today. In fact, the Kankakee and Beaverville actually uses an old Conrail line up to Kankakee, and believe it or not, it serves up to 17 businesses. I know it doesn't even seem possible that some tiny little short line out in the middle of unpopulated Indiana and Illinois could serve that many businesses, but it is true. And it takes most of these grain cars right down to Danville, and Norfolk Southern takes care of the rest. So the short lines are actually a servant or a slave to the larger railroad companies. So if you were in the Frankfort area in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s, this is what you would have seen. Now, from my understanding, this company called Nickel Plate Road back in the 50s and 60s was a very successful and profiting railroad. In fact, I read where other smaller railroads wanted to merge with the Nickel Plate, and the Nickel Plate turned them down because their profit margin did not meet the standard of the Nickel Plate. And the tragedy about that whole merger process, if the Nickel Plate had to merge with some East Coast company, like New York, New Jersey, Boston area, and it had never merged with the Norfolk and Western, you all understand this line, Frankfort to St. Louis, this would be like a welded rail main line getting 10 to 15 trains a day right now. But because of the merger with the Norfolk and Western and the Wabash route, it eliminated this St. Louis main line used by the Nickel Plate. But, history is what it is. If anyone has any good knowledge, any interesting stories about the old Nickel Plate or railroads around Frankfort, just leave a comment under the video.